Rick is from California. He's raised in San Francisco, went to Santa Clara, and went to San Francisco State and ended up doing his PhD at one of the most prestigious colleges we have in the state, UC Santa Barbara. UC Santa Barbara has produced some of the greatest historians and anthropologists of our time. And so Rick stands with a pretty impressive crowd. Rick then went on to live in London, where he still lives. So that's why he's up at 3 a.m. and we're all just still having drinks and cocktails. Rick went on to teach for the University of Maryland in London, and then eventually started his own marketing and communications firm, where he's been for the last 25 years, Rick, is that true? Yeah.
Yeah, it was 25 years, yeah.
So he's just turned over the reins, and he decided that he'd go back to one of his early loves, which is history. And he has written a book on his mother's family. His mother was Justinian Care, and her family coming to the historic pioneer families of California. And then his great uncle, which was Joseph B. Chiles, which we all here in Napa know for Chiles Valley and the family, and he was a great trailblazer. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Rick Chiles. Rick, take it away.
Thank you very much, Shelley, and good evening, everybody. I'm delighted and pleased to be joining you this evening. So without any more ado, I'll just start in. It was late summer 1841, and the slow-moving caravan of wagons and horsemen, and I've lost my place. Sorry about that. Okay. And the slow-moving caravan of wagons and horsemen were camped at Soda Springs in what is now known as southeastern Idaho. The next morning, they traveled northwest in the direction of Fort Hall until they reached a fork in the trail. They had gotten to the point of decision. Their guide, Broken Hand Fitzpatrick, had been adamant they should turn towards Fort Hall and Oregon Territory. After a short pause to say their final goodbyes, and in defiance of the best advice, 34 of them headed southwest. The only woman in the party observed they had no roads and no pilot except the setting sun. A little over 100 years later, Irene Patton expressed it thus: youth turned towards California, turned also the hothead, the adventurer, the gay ne'er-do-well, the invincible optimist, the gambler. I'm here tonight to talk to you about my relative, Joseph B. Chiles, who turned southwest on that summer afternoon in 1841. Was he a young hothead, an adventurer, a ne'er-do-well, an invincible optimist, a gambler? That's what I've attempted to answer in my book, Forgotten Trailblazer, Joseph B. Chiles and the Making of California, now featured on an Amazon website near you. That's the commercial part. I'd like to give you an insight about how I came to write this book, and in my presentation, I'd like to talk about this pioneer within the context of historical writing on the American West. And in the process, to touch on why Lynn Weber, in her book, Old Napa Valley, called him the atom of a generation of pioneers who traveled from the Mississippi Valley to try their luck and test their mettle in the far West. First, the why, what, and how. Why write this book? Why call it Forgotten Trailblazer? What were the origins of the book? Is this a biography of an individual or an account of an historical era and its events? For us today, mid-19th century California presents an interesting stage in the development of a new society, particularly in its chief city and surroundings, the raw and burgeoning San Francisco, gateway to its famed gold fields. With the news of the death of President Zachary Taylor in July 1850, and the achievement of statehood in August that same year, plans were being laid for a grand parade to commemorate the old hero of the Mexican War and celebrate California statehood. Half a dozen worthies, all early arrivals on the West Coast, called for a meeting of men who could claim residency of at least 3 years in California to march in a distinct formation in the parade. A modest group of men, 40 or 50 of them, responded to the call and marched as a contingent through the newly minted San Francisco downtown. These were the original pioneers of the pre-gold rush era, who had taken the greatest risks to reach the West Coast. Now, a few years later, San Francisco was growing by the day, and California society was stratifying and becoming more complex as the world flooded in. The society that they helped found in the previous decade was under threat of being forgotten in the tidal wave of new arrivals. What would become of the memory of the first modest influx? Everything about the new state seemed to be happening at lightning speed, and the founders of the Society of California Pioneers, new arrivals themselves, feared that their feats would soon be submerged, like the indigenous and Hispanic populations. And from these concerns arose an organization, in their words, to cultivate social bonds, to collect and preserve information related to California history, and to perpetuate the memory of the early pioneers. They would do everything they could to burnish their memory and keep it bright. Their first vice president, Joseph P. Chiles. In 1850, a logical choice. 170 years later, a name merely provoking the question, who? What does this tell us about the career of Joseph Chiles? What was the context of his actions? How was he judged then, and how do we judge him now? But to start, why write this book about an individual when so many took part in the Great Westward Migration? Traditionally, the historical writing of the early days of California was like most 19th and early 20th century historical writing. It was the great man school of history, which was dominated by the actions of individuals, usually male. Those who wrote about them focused on their accomplishments that were considered extraordinary, and usually to the exclusion of everyone else, the indigenous population or the female half of the population. These get a mention only in passing, if at all. But in the last 50 years or so, we've seen the emergence of a more analytical school of thought in which details of the lives of early arrivals in California are used as a way to open the door on an analysis of frontier times and practices, their reactions to the alien world in which they found themselves, including the treatment of native populations and women, for example, creating a much more nuanced picture of the context of the westward migration and the formative days of California. The noted historian John Unruh pointed out in his masterful analysis of Western historical writing, published almost 50 years ago, he said, in more than a century of scholarship, the subject matter of the westward movement was either narrowly particular or broadly general. Analytical and interpretive accounts were rarely found. There were some exceptions. Typical years were examined, such as 1841, 1843, 46, and of course, 1849. Other writers followed tradition and focused on, excuse me, a specific immigrant, usually based on a written record that they left behind. Bucking the trend were people like the Paddens, Irene and her self-effacing husband, William, who identified and retraced most of the trails established and followed by the pioneers. Others, like George Stewart, in his book, The California Trail, opted for a structure which examined the westward movement year by year from 1841 onwards to elaborate on the challenges of the trail and its destination. and incidentally devoting a chapter on 1843 to Chiles. In many of the works on the period, we see the tension between focusing on the heroic individual and locating that individual within the larger narrative. So, where does this book on Joe B. Chiles fit in? I hope that it fills the gap in the story dominated by the better known figures of the founding era of modern California, and in so doing helps illuminate the formation of a new society on the Pacific. Why did I call the book Forgotten Trailblazer? As this new California society took shape, by the 1850s, Joe B. Chiles was the man who knew everyone, and now no one knows. By the 1850s, Californians were creating their history and enshrining it in organizations like the Society of California Pioneers. And although Joe B. Chiles was indisputably one of the most qualified, he was more than happy to be vice president, not president. More of that later. The result of his reticence about appearing in the spotlight is that 170 odd years later, he appears just as a footnote or a passing reference in most of the major works on the westward movement. Life was intertwined with many of the best known pioneers: Kit Carson, John C. Fremont, Mariano Vallejo, John Bidwell, George Yount, the people who crossed the plains and got involved in the making of this part of California. For decades, historians pursued the details of the lives and works of these and other individuals, creating interesting portraits of people who accomplished enviable deeds. But the focus of Western history has changed in recent years from examining the lives of outstanding individuals to the identification of their place in the bigger picture, the interactions of early arrivals with the indigenous populations, or the impact on the environment from their pursuit of riches, or the creation of the structures of statehood that influence our lives today. And yet, for all the importance of context, there should be something to be learned from individual pioneers like Chiles, whose life was truly extraordinary, who walked across the plains 7 times in the 13 years between 1841 and 1854, built a ranch on a land grant next to the Napa Valley, whose mercantile activities during the gold rush made him a tidy fortune, whose relatives bought and lost one of the most celebrated ranches and land commission cases in California history, who was instrumental in the founding of the town of Davis, and whose varying fortunes and those of his relatives give us a portrait not only of an individual, but of one of the formative decades of California. I hope to share my thoughts on the man and where he fits into these decades of Northern California for about 40 minutes, and then open the discussion to questions. But before we begin, as Shelley noted, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. So if I start to put myself to sleep, just give me a shout or rattle your dinner cutlery and wake me up. Thanks for that. And after that drum roll, let's make a start. But first, a refreshment. I began my preparation for this talk about my great-granduncle by trying to imagine what you might like to hear, and decided early on that you probably didn't want to hear me quoting long passages out of a book that you could read for yourself should your interest be piqued enough by my remarks to get your hands on a copy. So rather than that, I thought I'd give you something of what is not in the book, the decision-making of what to include and what to exclude, the background in which Joe B. operated, and how he was affected by one of the formative experiences of American history. As we all know, the westward movement was an exceptional and decisive event in the making of our country, our state, and our corner of modern-day California, the Napa Valley. It's central to the book as it was to the life of Joe B. Chiles. Between the foreground of his accomplishments and the background of the westward movement, I hope to give the big picture with enough detail to get you interested in this forgotten man and his times. Now, like many good stories, this one started at the local bar. At one of our family get-togethers, as our group chatted in the corner of Vladimir's, the Inverness watering hole, a 20-something nephew told me about going to family parties when he was growing up, and there were regular references among the adults to a formidable ancestor called Joby, which to his juvenile ears understood as being spelled as Joby. And he grew up wanting to know more about this Joby. It was not until he was almost an adult that he realized that the Joby that the family was talking about was Joe B. Chiles, who had crossed the continent 7 times in the 1840s and 50s, leading wagon trains and doing heroic things. For myself, I'd gotten a PhD in California history, as Shelley mentioned, and thought I could bring some academic rigor to the quest for Joe B. Chiles. I'd had some success in getting 2 books published about my mother's family, out of Justinian care, an early San Francisco arrival from France via Genoa and Cape Horn. I parlayed success as a gold rush entrepreneur, selling mining hardware and assay supplies, while investing in banking and real estate. His most notable investment was Santa Cruz Island off the Southern California coast. Having dealt with the maternal side of the family, I was inspired by my nephew's naive question to get involved in writing some of my father's family history. So what's new in this book? At the outset, I had to confront the fact that more than 50 years ago, with the financial and documentary encouragement of one of my child's cousins, professional historian Helen Giffen wrote a slim volume entitled Trailblazing Pioneer, Colonel Joseph Ballinger Chiles. It's a handsome artifact, printed by the noted antiquarian bookseller and publisher John Howell, who from their Post Street office and shop dominated the San Francisco fine book trade for 73 years. On hand-cut laid paper, with titles picked out in red ink, it speaks as much to the craft of small press printing, closer to the traditions of the last 2 centuries, than to the digital on-demand world in which we live today. So the first question I had to answer when I set out to look for Joe B. was, what more could there be to say? Surely Giffen had covered the ground. As I pressed on and began my research and rereading the Giffen book, long out of print, I found myself dissatisfied on several counts. In Giffen's telling of Joe B.'s story, he was all foreground, like a movie in which the hero appears in close-up in every frame. As a trained historian, it was too much flashing blue eyes and rippling muscles for me to be comfortable. Though that's not to deny Joe B. his physical attributes, his height at 6'4", his red hair, his musical ability with the fiddle. But of equal interest for me was the context of the story, the bigger picture, the westward movement, and the creation of a new society on the Pacific coast. I took the decision that only by combining Chiles' outstanding characteristics, accomplishments, while developing his place in the larger picture, pulling back from the close-up, would we be able to understand the man himself and see what he had to say to us in 21st century California. Chiles spent more time on the California Trail than almost anyone of his generation, experiencing it from the beginning. The outset, in 1841, facing him and his companions, was an almost completely trackless Great Desert and High Sierra. By the time of his last crossing in 1854, the trail was an approximation of Interstate 80, with clearly marked routes, tolls, bridges, and mountain passes. All it was missing by 1854 was the California Highway Patrol. Surely any depiction of the man and his times would include the terrain through which he traveled and the people he traveled with, largely absent from the Giffen book. There was also the problem that if the historian wanted to put the heroic figure front and center, we had to know what they were thinking, their motivations and reactions to their circumstances. And here was the central challenge to telling this story. To get to grips with Joe B., you had to deal with someone who was strikingly old-fashioned in their modesty, largely disregarded his own accomplishments. It wasn't that he couldn't read and write. He'd had the basic frontier education as a boy in Missouri. More that he didn't choose to chronicle his accomplishments. The atom of a generation didn't want to be more than vice president of the society established to celebrate him and his contemporaries. He dismissed his own achievements as nothing special, nothing that others hadn't done. And so, Joe B. Chiles never quite emerges from the shadows. He's one of those figures seen tantalizingly on the edge of the frame when others are jostling for the central position. And yet he was there in the first wagon train and 6 subsequent crossings. He was there as that first ragged little group staggered into John Marsh's ranch in November 1841. He saw Monterey, Yerba Buena, Sonoma, and Napa County when the largest towns in this part of the world were small collections of very modest dwellings. He counted among his friends most of the other figures who dominated the Northern California landscape. One of his sons-in-law was Jerome C Davis, who gave his name to that city and college town in the Sacramento Valley. He negotiated with the Mexican Californio administration of the early 1840s, with the local native tribes on his land grant, Rancho Catacula, with the Bear Flag rebels, and with George Yount, from whom he purchased a Rutherford property that became Inglenook. Incidentally, George was a friend of Chiles for 40 years, with whom he ended up in court. So that's another real California story. He was known and respected by the other pioneers in his part of the world, but even when sitting down with one of the scribes set out by Bancroft, he was a man of few words. All that they could squeeze out of him was a couple of paragraphs, one of them devoted to praising the lone woman on that first crossing, Nancy Kelsey. What did all this mean for the career of Joe B. Chiles? As Mark Twain put it, there are 2 important days in your life, the day you were born and the day you know why. We've already heard from Irene Padden about the types who headed for California, the young, the gamblers, the optimists. So between Twain and Padden, what can we learn of Joe B. Chiles? And what can we learn from him? Much of what we know about him is from the words of others, Bidwell, Reed, and other diarists, who commented on the experience of the trail in early California, which included Chiles, as well as specifically talking about the things that he did. The more I looked, the more convinced I became that there was more to learn from Chiles' experiences. And these would help shed some light on the larger picture of the westward movement and the settlement of California, as Chiles interacted with his fellow pioneers, with the native population, and the Hispanic inhabitant, particularly in Napa and Sonoma. The temptation to focus on the exceptionalism of Joe B. Chiles is strong, starting with his family roots in pioneering that reach back to Jamestown, Virginia in 1638. That Virginia land grant, received by the original Chiles settler, was followed 150 years later by the reward of bounty lands for veterans of the Revolutionary War. And the need for land over the decades pushed the family westward to Clark County in frontier Kentucky, then to Jackson County in frontier Missouri. It's often been observed that those most likely to populate the frontier were those who came from the previous frontier. And this was the trajectory of the Chiles family. Their DNA was Westering, and Joe B. fully shared it. In terms of context, looking for the motivation of the Chiles family to move on to the next frontier, we can actually see the early effects of globalization, the impact of the global trading system on the lives of people thousands of miles from the financial center of the world, which at that time was London, where decisions were made that hit the frontier cotton growers and other raw materials exporters hard. The context of the Western frontier in the 1830s was generally one of hard times. Missouri had been plunged into recession as part of the global trading system. Crops which were produced there had experienced a severe drop in demand linked to the financial crash. This provided the context for what happened next. When hard times hit Joe B. in western Missouri in the 1830s, they came on the heels of a personal tragedy, the death of his young wife and mother of his 4 children in 1836. At the same time, they provided the impulse to seek out far horizons in the company of like-minded individuals like John Bidwell, whose name is forever attached to that episode in 1841, although he was a junior member of the party. It's proof of Winston Churchill's dictum, "History will be kind to me because I intend to write it." It was his description of the journey of 1841 that was delivered by Joe B. to the editor of the newspaper in Independence in 1842 that stuck his name on the party of which Joe B. was one of the senior members at age 31. What we know of their adventures and misadventures on the way to John Marsh's ranch in the shadow of Mount Diablo, we owe to John Bidwell, who remained a lifelong friend of Chiles. And although the Bidwell-Bartleson Company are credited as the first party to make it overland, to tell the truth, by the time they arrived in California, they had become not a party of pioneers, but a badly lost group of stragglers whose survival owed as much to good luck as anything else. The Bidwell-Bartleson party was atypical in several ways, in not following anyone or any map or any guide after Fort Hall, and in having no one follow their route afterwards. Certainly Chiles never tried to follow the same trail, and few had as much experience of the changes of the trail over time as he did. Once he reached his goal, from his travels, we can get a picture of Mexican California as he made his way to the Pueblo of San Jose, the capital Monterey, Vallejo, Sonoma, Georgetown's Napa Valley, and Sutter's Fort on the Sacramento. This was hardly the totality of California, but by the time Chiles returned to Independence the following year, he had a good idea of the place he wanted to live and how to support himself once he was settled there. Or as Horace Greeley put it, to grow up with the country. By the start of the following year, he was ready to set out from Missouri once again. And his reputation was such that there was little difficulty in attracting willing volunteers to take part in what many believed would be a straightforward crossing. This turned out to be far from the case, as the party was forced to split into 2 at Fort Hall, with the wagons heading southwest and the horsemen heading northwest. But ultimately, all the members of the party arrived in California one way or another, several of them settling in the Napa Valley. And more was added to the sum of knowledge about the strange and challenging land that had to be crossed in order to achieve the goal. It was worth noting that this group that he piloted across the continent were 2 of the children of George Yount, who hadn't seen their father in 15 years, since the day he'd stepped out with a group of trappers heading southwest. From here, we can highlight other exceptional activities, from the acquisition of the Catacoula land grant, latterly known as the Chiles Valley, to the building of the grist mill and an adobe brick house in the valley with the help of his lifelong friend Billy Baldridge and the local tribe, the Wapo. Chiles set about creating a farmstead on the model of pioneering that had worked for generations of Chiles before him in Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri, with cattle, fruit, and vegetables, and grain, which could be ground into flour at his mill, or provide the raw material for whiskey, both profitable enterprises. All this activity left Chiles with little energy or interest in involvement in the politics of Mexican California and the schemes to create an independent state which would join the United States, following the model laid down by the Texans a few years before. He was well known in the area, admired for the craft of his, which was demonstrated on his increasingly prosperous farmstead, but he stepped back from involvement in the Bear Flag Revolt, in spite of the urgings of Billy Baldridge, whose reactions to the sound of gunfire and rumors of gold were much more typical of their generation. We're left with the conclusion that Chiles felt that he knew a few things well, and he was going to stick with them. This remained true of his eastward crossing in 1847 and westward crossing in 1848, when he fulfilled his ambition to rebuild his family by returning with his teenage children, pausing only long enough at Sutter's Fort, which at that point was the epicenter of gold fever, to refresh his animals and then press on to the Catacoula. His delight at the sight of the prospering ranch was tempered by the much more typical reaction of Billy Baldridge to the news of gold. Baldridge had been successfully managing the Catacoula in Joe B's absence. But no sooner had he handed back responsibility for the ranch to its owner than Baldridge was off for the gold fields, where it has to be admitted he made enough of a fortune to buy some substantial acreage near Oakville. Here are some pictures of what was known by now as the Chiles Valley, taken in the late 19th and early 20th century. The ones of the mill hail from the 20th century after it had stopped working, but was still a feature on the landscape. There is also a view of the adobe house, which reflects the relative prosperity of the Chiles descendants who came to occupy smaller and smaller parcels in the valley. If we could go back to the first slide of Joe B and have a look at, so first the patriarch, an image probably from the 1870s, looking stern and commanding for Bancroft, or perhaps he was still trying to get used to those false teeth. Go to the next slide. Then there's the image of the adobe, probably from the early 20th century, looking a bit careworn. And the next slide. Then there's the view from near the mill, looking up into the valley. The adobe is out of sight around to the left. The next slide, please. And finally, the mill itself. Semi-derelict in this picture in the early 20th century, having stopped working some 40 years before in the 1880s. The mill pond would have been upper left, with the mill race to take the water to the wheel running upper left to lower right. This, of course, was before the depredations of the wartime scrap merchants and vandals who took whatever metal they could pull out of the old structure, hastening its collapse. Next slide, please. And finally, a contemporary image of the house Chiles built in St. Helena to suit the desires of the teenage children of his second marriage to live in town on what became the Inglenook Winery. Well, now let's move off Joe B's generous veranda and pick up the story back at mid-19th century, the gold rush, where once again Chiles had stepped away from center stage. At the same time, what he did next shines a light on the opportunities that were triggered by the gold mining boom. That is to say, if Chiles couldn't get interested in digging for gold, as the mining industry evolved, he observed that there was a tidy fortune to be gained from supplying the needs of the miners. So he himself got involved in a ferry across the Sacramento River, which cleared a likely income of $1,000 a week in his first 3 months, comparable to about $350,000 today. There was the dairy farm west of Sacramento, which could supply the city and the gold fields with fresh milk at $1 a quart. And when those activities had played out, he had the cash from them and the flour and whiskey from the Chiles Valley Mill to invest in some of the rich agricultural lands in the vicinity of Davis, as well as ranches in Napa and Lake counties. His city residence was now a feature of St. Helena, as was his country retreat Quinac in Lake County. By the late 1850s, Chiles was a wealthy man, identified by the Daily Alta California in its list of rich men of Napa as having a net worth of $72,000, about 2.3 million in today's purchasing power. The contemporary newspapers of the day, the Napa County Reporter, St. Helena Star, and the Napa Register describe a rancher with 1,000 acres of wheat, 500 fruit trees, 600 head of cattle, and 100 horses and mules. He bought cattle in Texas and mules in Kentucky, but it wasn't all work. The reports of parties in St. Helena and balls and socials in the Chiles Valley, month-long hunting and fishing expeditions to Mendocino. All in all, there was a lot of shooting, fishing, and dancing. The parallels with the activities of my mother's family are clear. They prospered by catering to the needs of the miners and the mining companies who followed them. They invested their profits in land whose produce would feed the exploding population of the new state. That's a bit of a thumbnail sketch of Joe B. Chiles, his attributes and activities. And there's plenty to develop a portrait of an outstanding individual. But our modern era of historical analysis demands more in the way of context. Where and how did he fit into the making of California? To answer these questions, we turn to more recent analyses of the history of the West and westward migration. To borrow once again from Unruh, this new approach must also make clear that it is in the neglected interaction among the overlanders themselves and in the interaction between the overlanders and other groups in the West, the Army, the Indians, the Mormons, the traders, and other entrepreneurs, as well as in the interaction of the overlanders with the flora and fauna of the West, that the real explanation of how the feat was successfully accomplished will be found. So, as I said at the beginning, it was my intention to take the heroic individual and locate that person within the larger narrative, perhaps making them less heroic, but more accessible and instructive here in the 21st century. It became my goal to write about some of the key aspects of the formation of California through the experience of one individual, allowing for the Native American and Hispanic narratives to take their place in the story. All of which takes us into some very contemporary issues, such as the evaluation of our forebears. How can we judge Chiles in the light of the larger context? We'll be required to consult the judgments about the man based on what others have said about him and what actions he took when he found himself in the middle of the formative events of the making of California. Firstly, should we judge him? And which standards should we apply? Those of pre-Civil War America or the America of today? Our generation and the ones that come after us should be prepared to raise the basic questions. Was Chiles someone we can admire? Was his life exemplary? Or did he embody some of those less appealing traits that come to the fore when people are pushed to the limit? What about the episodes on various crossings where he sold whiskey to trappers and their indigenous companions with predictable results? Where he insisted on taking up wagon space with trade goods instead of food, being over-optimistic about the availability of food that could be bought, hunted, or gathered along the trail. There have been instances cited where he claimed trail prices for food when others were hungry, and driving similar hard bargains in exchange for helping out strugglers in his party. And how do we account for Chiles' Southern sympathies? Probably including taking a benign view of slavery, consistent with his Southern roots. Though I've not seen any evidence that he participated in Black slavery in California. And as far as his relationship with the local indigenous people, whose population was much diminished by a smallpox epidemic in the decade before he arrived at the Catacoula, was there anything other than a sharecropping arrangement that was in common usage on the larger California landholdings at the time, and persisted throughout the West and the South for decades? These kinds of questions push us into a very contemporary dilemma. Notably, how do we judge the actions and attitudes of our forebears? Chiles doesn't have any statues put up to him in his honor, but if he did, should we be pulling them down? For my answer, I looked for some expert advice from contemporary ethicists who hold, and I'm paraphrasing here, there's a danger if we judge those who have gone before us through the retrospectoscope, that we will constantly find ourselves condemning our forebears for not being as enlightened as we are. The answer of these ethicists seems to be that if the actions of the individuals that we are examining were generally in line with those of their contemporaries, and not markedly exceeding them. We should look at their deeds in a clear-eyed way, taking the good with the bad, and appreciate people operated in historical periods different from our own, and combine the same sorts of mixed motivations that we have in our own day. Chiles was a man of pre-Civil War America, born in the South, and for all the instances that we have of him taking a hard line about prices on the trail, or being over-optimistic about obtaining food along the way, or allowing the Confederate flag to fly from his porch in Catalina and similar dubious actions, there's also evidence of his generosity to the Donner rescue parties, to fellow immigrants with nowhere to live in their first winter in California, the guarantees he provided friends that were later defaulted on, which cost him portions of his own land holdings, and well-documented kindnesses to family, friends, and neighbors. I mentioned that he counted John C. Fremont as a friend. His friendship extended to crossing from California to Washington, D.C. in 1847 to be a character witness at his friend's trial. That's a long walk. A recent article by Susan Anderson in the California Historical Society magazine highlights the fact that although California entered the Union as a free state, there were still many recent arrivals from the South who supported slavery, or even arrived in California with their slaves who were forced to work in the mines and elsewhere. In this context, I've seen no evidence that Chiles participated in the institution of slavery in California. Our judgment of Chiles, the man, is of course complicated by the fact that he left behind little evidence of his inner thoughts and attitudes. We can only judge his actions. I didn't come across any direct evidence of actions that were outside the norms of behavior of California at the time. On the other hand, there are many remembrances, written and oral, that demonstrate his care for his fellow pioneers, as well as an absence of the brutal behavior and wanton disregard for the rights of others exhibited by more than a few of his contemporaries. There you have it. Thank you for listening to my answers to the questions why I wrote the book, who was Joe B. Chiles, and what was the world he inhabited, and how we can come to a judgment of the man and his times. Those were my questions when I set out to write Forgotten Trailblazer, and I hope I can get you to agree that I answered them between the covers of the book. Now let me turn you over to Shelley, who will field the questions that you might have, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Folks, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat. Chat, you can see is at the bottom of your screen. You just click it, and then you can write any questions you have. I've read the book that Rick wrote. It's really fascinated. I'm very interested, of course, in history of the valley that I was born in and raised in. And you know, one of the questions I think that's really pertinent today, Rick, is the kind of you know, we look back with ethics of today, but we're really looking at people, you know, 170 years ago and their ethics. And it is interesting to me. And so if you have anything, is it Joe B's father, as I understand, didn't have slaves, that Joe B, although he was raised with a Southern attitude, benevolence towards slavery, his family actually didn't have slaves. Is that true?
That is true to the best of my knowledge. They were, you know, hardworking farmers, and they did the work themselves. They didn't have large land holdings, and we're like the majority of Southerners. They didn't own slaves, or if they did own any, it was very small numbers, so. That would have been Joe B's expectation. I think that he was a much more typical farmer of the time. You know, he just knew what needed to be done and got on and did it.
Well, I noticed it in the group that he came across with in 41. The Kelseys were in the group. Barnett was in the group. These are all Missourians who came in right at that 41 point. of those that came in that one, and the ones who came into the Napa Valley, is Chiles the only one who became a Mexican citizen? Because Barnett did not become one. Kelsey did not become a Mexican citizen. None of those guys did.
Well, I suppose the answer is he just played it by the rules, and his friendship with Vallejo would have persuaded him that this was the route to go. So if your friend Mariano said, okay, now the next step is get on down to Monterey, and it's going to cost you $10 for the piece of paper for the deed to be written on, and it's going to be worth it. So go on down there and do the business.
Sounds good. Okay, we have a question here. It says, could you elaborate on your relationship to Joe B?
Well, my great-grandfather was a nephew of Joe B. And as Joe B became more prosperous and saw more opportunities, he sent word back to Missouri to get as many of the younger generation out there to help him out and just, get in on it. He seemed to be kind of desperate to encourage members of his family to take advantage. So he put the word out, and it got back to Isaac Chiles, who then came out and made his own way, also working for Joe B and working for others. And then Isaac eventually started a family, and one of his sons was James Franklin Chiles, who was my grandfather.
Great. Isn't this the family that started Blue Diamond Almonds? Is this the same?
That's yep. That's correct. They became very prosperous in and around the town of Davis, and of course, after the gold rush, the next real gold rush was agriculture, and they looked around for crops that were going to have give a good return, and my grandfather was one of the pioneers who established Blue Diamond Almond Raising Cooperative.
I think we all know it. So that's quite wonderful.
Hard to avoid in the checkout
checkout lane. So Shannon asks, you do talk about his participation, that his interaction with First People, Indigenous people, was not the first time when he crossed into the West. Could you talk a little bit about his? You cover it in the book, but talk about the Seminole Wars that he was participated in Florida.
Well, it is one of those things. His wife had died. His mother had taken on the primary caring role of children in the nature of things in those days, and quite a bit today. And so Joe B, had his roots pulled up, and at the same time, the Seminole Wars had broken out, and what else for a young man to do who was of the frontier persuasion than go down there and volunteer. And so I think he was only involved in one or two battles, and afterwards would claim that he'd seen enough of that kind of life to last him a lifetime. And he got himself back to Missouri, where he fell in with Bidwell and the others, and they laid their plans for California.